Hi, and welcome to Ethnographic Imagination Basel, a series on how to reimagine the world from the mundane. My name is George Paul Meiu, and this episode will be on intimacy. Our guest is Peter Geschiere, who has researched intimacy from a diverse set of angles, including witchcraft, conspiracy, belonging, and sexuality. So stay tuned for a conversation on how intimacy can help us reimagine the world. Peter Geschiere is Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at the University of Amsterdam. He's author of by now very well-known books, including Village Communities and the State, Changing Relations among the Maka of South-Eastern Cameroon, published in 1982, The Modernity of Witchcraft, published in 1997, The Perils of Belonging, Autochthony, Citizenship and Exclusion in Africa and Europe, published in 2009, and Witchcraft, Intimacy and Trust, Africa in Comparison, published in 2013. Peter, a warm welcome to Ethnographic Imagination Basel. Before we start even asking what intimacy is, this complex term that seems to be everywhere, let me start by asking you first how you came to encounter it. You have written extensively about intimacy, from your work on witchcraft and kinship to your study of belonging and citizenship, and most recently to your work on conspiracy and sexuality. Intimacy seems to remain an important domain of understanding the world. How did you happen upon it the first time? When did you come to think this is a really important concept one cannot set aside? And how do you make sense of the fact that it pops up across all these diverse topics and themes that you've researched throughout the years?
Well, I'm afraid that it's a long story and we don't want to long stories. Let me first say I'm very happy to be in Basel and I'm impressed by all the things that are happening here. Intimacy was certainly not an important topic for me when I started my research. It more or less I came across it and became in principle I did not like the concept so much, but I became increasingly fascinated by its ambiguities, and I think there's all sorts of tensions inside that notion that are very relevant for present day issues and for present day dilemmas. I came across it in the context of what I could call witchcraft studies. Witchcraft is a terrible word, and there again I more or less stumbled on the notion because I did fieldwork in Cameroon. I wanted to study politics, state formation. I was not allowed to work on that because as a foreigner you're not supposed to study national politics, so I had to study politics in the village. In the village, people, when I wanted to talk politics, they started to talk Jambe, which they translated as sorcellerie, witchcraft. So the term is terrible, of course, but it is around, so we have to live with it. What astonished me very much in the way they talked about this Jambe was the link with kinship. So Jambe, the witchcraft, is always an attack from close by, from inside the family, and I was kind of, it surprised me, and it was not, I was wondering why, and I was not at all expecting such a close link to intimacy, to the intimacy of kinship. I became ever more interested in the topic because of Western audiences reacting very shocked. Western audiences tended to be very shocked when I started to talk about this link with kinship, and it was seen as something weird, something that confirmed the otherness of Africa. While, of course, I have no statistics, but probably quite a large percentage of my audiences had been in the West, had been on the couch with a shrink, with a psychiatrist. So they should know Freud is not telling us, is telling us more or less the same, that all the aggression inside the family, that is so dangerous. So that is why I became ever more interested in this notion of intimacy. Another thing, only in 2010 I started to work really on a book. I work on these topics since 1971, so a long, long time. But intimacy became ever bigger topic in what I was doing. And I was hoping also, of course, this notion of witchcraft is a terrible notion. It's very shifting, but it attracts a lot of attention also in the West. But its meanings are very, very double and ambiguous. I hope that the link with intimacy could help to to anchor the concept of witchcraft, to give it more. So that's why I started reading about intimacy, and I was very shocked I was shocked more or less by the way intimacy is treating in modern literature, especially. Of course, there's Anthony Giddens on intimacy, and his version of intimacy is so far away of what these people in Cameroon were telling me, and of Freud, of course. Intimacy is the apex of modernity. It's wonderful. It's a kind of it's related to companionate marriage. Well, I won't go, but this kind of underside, this kind of twist, this kind of tension inside intimacy is completely absent. So I was kind of surprised that the recent literature on intimacy was no help at all. The older literature was. So Freud, but especially Seminal, was a lot more. What Seminal writes about stranger, that relates to stranger, that is part of intimacy, that is needed inside the intimacy, is very relevant for the way the Maka talk about intimacy as dangerous. So what I try to do in the book on intimacy is to show the doubleness of intimacy, the ambiguity, and I think that's very relevant. We can talk more about that for the present day world. There's a kind of feeling of loss of intimacy. There's a kind of romanticizing intimacy. But of course, intimacy has a long history inside the West also of, you only have to mention Mauriac Le Nœud de Vipère, what is it in English, the translation, the knot of serpents, something like that. It's a famous novel on the tensions inside a family, and that's exactly relates to how the Maka talk about intimacy as a danger from close by. And for me, that is very helpful in the sense that it helps to de-exoticize witchcraft. That it's not about otherness, that it's about conflicts that are everywhere not the same, everywhere expressed differently, but are very much recognizable across cultural differences.
De-exoticize and probably de-exceptionalize it as a topic that relates to only particular places, especially Africa. So in that case, then you would say witchcraft is an inherent potential of intimacy, more broadly construed, one side of something that we would otherwise romanticize as the intimate.
I would now, but that took a long time for me to come to that point, but I would now try to be tempted to characterize witchcraft as the fear for the realization that there is aggression close by, that in the inner circle there is solidarity, there's help, there's assistance, but there's also terrible jealousy, which is not a major discovery, of course, but it took me a long time to realize that, and I think if I see the recent literature on intimacy, there is this kind of tendency of making intimacy wonderful, romanticizing intimacy, and I think that's dangerous.
And in that sense, too, comparing witchcraft discourses with the discourses of psychotherapy, for example, which are also about those kind of histories of aggression from the near and dear, from the intimate space, seems a way to kind of both de-exceptionalize it and show a certain kind of broader humane aspect involved in both. Before we return to some of these topics you've already mentioned, let me take a step back, and for our wider audience who might not be so familiar with the concept, try to think about what is intimacy? It's such a complex and nebulous term. How would we be able to spell it out for our audience? And why do you think it matters for us to talk about intimacy when we try to imagine and understand our world today and in the past?
Difficult to define things like that. You can use intimacy in very different senses, of course. It can mean simple proximity, closeness. Maybe closeness, I like the term closeness. And you can be close in many, many senses. I mean, so in that sense, I would not like to pin the term down. I'm tempted now much more... for instance, in the research on Cameroon, you can use witchcraft, Jallo, if you want to use that word, as a kind of measurement of intimacy. So when in certain contexts there's a danger of witchcraft, in other dangers less. So that shows what intimacy is when you feel threatened by. So I can be more specific. In the 70s. People started to migrate to the big cities from the village, and then being in the city was supposed to be a protection against witchcraft from the village. So people who felt bewitched by the villagers would stay in the city, and then they were safe. Now you see very different patterns, in the sense that all sorts of urban forms of witchcraft, this occult aggression, come from the city into the village. So the distance is no longer that big. So apparently intimacy, so now, of course, what's very striking is that in the 70s, anthropologists in Cameroon were often told, don't worry about witchcraft, it does not cross the sea, it does not cross the water. So if you're back in America or back in Europe, you're safe and all that. Now, there are many migrants from Cameroon in Europe, in the States, and all my Cameroonian friends in Holland keep changing their phone number. So which drives me crazy, because I have this endless list of phone numbers. The secret is that the phone is dangerous. So it's so clearly, so phone calls from home are wonderful. They are you talk to your your relatives at a great distance, you feel close again. But they are very dangerous at the same time, because relatives can be angry. So there is now, in the Maka terms, you would say that in Jallo, the house is now spreading, is now transcontinental.
And yet, it means that then the new technologies allow for new forms of intimacy. So if witchcraft can be perpetuated through phone calls or, let's say, social media,
yes.
The intimate gets reconfigured. So it's proximate, but proximate not necessarily by two bodies being in the same place, proximity being established through all kinds of means.
Yeah. But it's so. One of the criticisms on my work, recent criticisms, is that I do not take into account in the 70s people hardly used. People had certainly no mobile phones. The internet was not yet there. It's only since 2000 that the new technology, the new social media, add a whole new appendix, a whole new extension to these ideas about witchcraft and intimacy, which is true. And I think, the recent fieldwork is very interesting in that sense, that it is also, I mean, there is a kind of, there's not a radical break. Kinship keeps coming back through the back door. In these stories, there's a kind of, so what you see is that the new media dilute this link, more or less, make it applicable in all sorts of new contexts. And you have now, of course, like this bewitching by through the phone. You have all sorts of more impersonal forms of witchcraft. So there are these pandemic crises throughout Africa for some time. There was a lot of warning not to pick up the phone when there was an unknown number, and you would fall dead if you answered the number and all that. So there, the link with kinship is diluted, but is a kind of, it keeps coming back. So it is, intimacy gets new meanings. It means also that there is also an idea I would say in the West certainly, of a lost intimacy. I mean, the intimacy through new social media is different from the intimacy of seeing somebody, of being close to somebody.
I'm thinking in the context of intensified transnational migration, in which kinship itself takes new forms, remittances across long distances, communications over phone calls, and things like that. Now, what the house is, so you said the witchcraft starts in the house, in the home. What the house is becomes reconfigured. I can imagine those contexts in which you pick up the phone of the family back home, and it can be, well, I wouldn't want to say necessarily traumatizing, but infuriating to be constantly confronted with the obligations, expectations of the home, and hence also with the danger of, in this case, bewitchment, but it can be also the danger of being reconfronted with these histories of tension.
Yes. Yes.
Aggression, as you called it. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's an interesting difference. For instance, I would say that the house in many African societies has a very flexible, the house is very, very open, can be enlarged. There's a striking contrast, for instance, many European studies on European witchcraft emphasize that witchcraft is not among kin, but among neighbors. So there's the famous book by Favre-Sada, a wonderful French anthropologist who worked in Normandy in the 70s and discovered a whole world of witchcraft and bewitching and hatred and jealousy and etc. and rituals in the countryside. And she emphasized very strongly that witchcraft is not between kin, but it's between neighbors. But if you look more closely, there is a lot of, for her nephews who have their own farm are neighbors, not kin. While the African language, the African kinship language, has always been what anthropologists call classificatory, which is
so they could be kin.
The neighbors are always kin. Yeah. I mean, so everybody, I'm kin, everybody's included. So that means a different language about intimacy, which is interesting, I think. So there is, it would be interesting to know more about notions of the house in Europe, in India, for instance, in China, and notions of the house in Africa. That would be interesting.
This actually leads me to the next question I wanted to ask you, which was, what common sense understandings of intimacy should we try to displace, to put aside, in order to better understand these complex ambiguities and ever-shifting dynamics of intimacy in the contemporary world? And going back to the point that you make in the Modernity of Witchcraft in your book, that again, witchcraft starts at the home. It is not necessarily about the foreigners over there, not necessarily about the neighboring village, but about people, and not about people one does not know, but quite the contrary, that it starts with kinship, that it starts with intimacy. In other words, as we said, we shouldn't romanticize intimacy. Intimacy can be traumatic, as Freud put it. But then intimacy seems to also be an ever-shifting thing. It can be about different notions of the house, who matters, how is proximity established? And here proximity is not necessarily who's right here next to me, but who I perceive as close. What other things might we need to change about common sense understandings of intimacy, especially when we romanticize it in everyday life and we keep turning to the intimate as the private, the space where you're safe from political dynamics, you're supposedly at your happiest, and so on?
Yeah, well, I think you gave the answer to your question already, more or less. I mean, there is a danger of romanticizing intimacy, and the kind of idea of a lost intimacy. The community, the notion of community, I think is very... The notion of community is all around. I mean, it's especially America, so they always see community. Minority groups are very strong about immediately suggesting, referring to the community. And so there is a sense of loss, a sense of retrieving a community, and that means romanticizing. And I think it's that romanticizing is dangerous, because it's, I think you have to to keep to take into account and to remain taking into account the kind of tension there is always, which is kind of pessimistic message maybe, but I think the main thing is to not to try to fix these notions, and that's what's very difficult for academics because they want to be clear. But I think we have to do with notions that are basically shifting. And so I think, although I love comparison, but I'm very prudent about what I just did now, what I shouldn't have done, to make contrast for African, European, Indian, European visions of the house and all that. What we see is all tendencies, shifting possibilities and changing notions. And so if you try to pin them down, I think it's very important to emphasize relations. So this relation between closeness and aggression, I think that is a relation that is important to bring out. And not to fix it.
I think you're asking us something very important here, to bear with the uncertainty of the term. And I think this is so important because we are living in a time when uncertainty has become chronic and where we aspire, desire, sometimes violently seek certainty. We need to know what works, what doesn't. We need to know who's with us or against us. We need to know who's a member of the community, hence of the intimate circle, and who's an aggressor of that community. So bearing with the uncertainty of the term intimacy almost makes us align ourselves against the zeitgeist that tells us we need to seek that certainty. And I think there is something about late capitalism in which the desire for certainty has become, I'd say, kind of not just common, but quite hegemonic. You can't, and comes to jeopardize this kind of more nuanced understandings of a shifting concept of the intimate. How do you see intimacy in this moment, in kind of a late capitalist context, more broadly? We do seem to invest ourselves in it. And what you just said also, the romantic aspiration around it, we romanticize it. We want to have that romance. It seems to be also a certain kind of desire that the moment you take it at an ethnographic level, you look at everyday life, how people actually live, it doesn't quite map. That romance doesn't quite exist other than an aspiration. So there seem to be all these paradoxes around the intimate. We romanticize it because we don't have it as such. We want to know for sure something about it because it is a shifting concept. And it seems confusing. and people might say, well, how do we pin this down? Why is it useful then?
Confusing. Confusion is all around. I would maybe take it in a somewhat different direction than you imply in your question. The uncertainty is nothing new. I mean, it's not that we are living in a time of precariousness and uncertainty. I mean, uncertainty is given with human society, I would say. I mean, the uncertainty that the Maka, where I worked in Cameroon, so their expression is the Jambo and Jau, the witchcraft of the house is the most terrible form of witchcraft. That's of the Jambo, that's how they say it. That translates to basic insecurity, because the house is the security, and so the most dangerous attack comes from inside the house. So this uncertainty is nothing new. I mean, that's we always have to live with uncertainty. So the romanticizing is dangerous, and maybe I go back to my disappointment with the recent literature on the intimacy. It expresses a very strong search among academics towards a kind of lost
paradise of sorts.
Lost paradise of certainty. Yeah. So there's the famous Anthropology has produced a graph which you see in many contexts. It's started by Marshall Salins. Marshall Salins is a towering figure in anthropology. He just died, so nothing, no nasty things about the death. But the graph is terrible misleading in the sense it is a kind of concentric circles with an arrow, and it means the inside circle. There's generalized reciprocity, as you call it. There's safety, and the further you go outside, the more insecurity there is.
The more hostility, the more negativity,
and that goes exactly against what I noticed in Cameroon, because the uncertainty is inside. So as long as anthropology, the graph is in all introductory books for anthropology and all that. So as long as it's there, I mean, it is important to emphasize that uncertainty is nothing new. That uncertainty is precisely inside the circle, and that. So again, maybe a pessimistic message.
But then the circles are not these stable things. They're on shaky grounds, and then we need to constantly reestablish the borders of the circles to feel secure and so on. Just perhaps leading into my last question. It requires a lot of attention to ambivalence, something that I always admired your work for, the kind of astute attention to contradiction not as exceptional, but as an inherent part of things that we have to attend to and elucidate and so on. Especially in relation to intimacy, but also more broadly, do we see that we're moving away from ambivalence? Is this desire for certainty that, in a way, as you said, is a longer sort of human, perhaps obvious desire to have? Is there something different in this moment, in the present, where the desire for certainty makes us move away from these ambivalences of intimacies towards the wish to have some more clear ideas about what it is? Who's part of the inner circle and who isn't?
I would be very interested in more research on the history of the word safe. When did it emerge so central in the West, especially in the West, and why, and what moment of time? And I find it confusing, to say the least. That. Of course, safe is, to be more concrete, the university should be a safe place. Mm-hmm. That is a basic, that raises questions. I mean, the university was always a place where you were challenged by. Of course, the university should be a place where you are protected and when minorities are protected and all that. That's very important, but to expand from there to that any feeling of unsafety is reason for alarm, that is another thing. And it would be interesting to see that in history. My answer to all these things is to historicize them, all this confusion. Yeah. When did it emerge? All these things are not given. They emerge in a certain context. In which context did it emerge and all that? And my guess, I would like to, maybe I should do it myself, to relate all that to the history of the notion identity.
And perhaps also, for me, I always was curious to think about the discursive production of the idea of the safe space. Again, it relates to your notion of the inner circle as somehow a given, which it is not, and trace that discursive link to the rise of the security state and security logics in a late capitalist context, which also turn to the intimate. It is the children of the neighborhood that should not be kind of endangered by the arrival of, foreigners, what have you. Those kind of logics we encounter very common. And there seems to be a genealogy of this discourse that also keeps returning to the intimate, and where then the ambivalence then get flashed out, as it were.
In our work on the conspiracy narratives, even the strengthening, the increase of the conspiracy plot thinking and the visceral power that all these conspiracies attain. And there is certainly an increase with social media. We work a lot with Boltanski, Luc Boltanski. And Bayard is also helpful in that, on their work on the nation state, Boltanski sees increasing tension between, on the one hand, the nation state's insistence on a project to create a reality, one uniform reality and the internationalizing tendencies of capitalism. So in that tension, conspiracy and all these feelings of insecurity become stronger. I don't know if that is the answer, but I would rather emphasize the notion of the way the nation state propagates identity as a more or less fixed classification. And I'm very interested in how identity came to be a central notion in the social sciences, for instance. In the 70s, identity was something social psychology, something individual. Now identity is everywhere. Groups have to have an identity.
And it has to be fixed. It has to be stable.
And it has to be fixed, and it has to be safe. So there's some sort of relation. But I'm sorry, all this is very vague and very open, but I think it are challenges that you have to face, and it's very important to look behind these notions, not to take them for granted, but to see the ambiguity of these notions, and especially of identity.
Peter, thank you so much for your time. You actually showed us just how complex the term is, and how resisting any effort to stabilize something like intimacy, precisely because it's complex relations to things like kinship, witchcraft, conspiracy, ideas of community, identity, and so on. It is important to maintain a certain kind of, if not suspiciousness, but a certain kind of question mark. Is this really as it seems? Or what's at stake in efforts to stabilize it, to pin it down, to get to the bottom of it as some sort of a certain element of our social life. For that,
that's very well formulated, and I'm sure that you will do the research that I'm sketching out now.
Inspired by your work, among others. Thank you very much for being here. And for our audience, you can learn more about many of these topics by looking up Peter Geschiere's books.